Next on our program is our featured speaker, Dr. Terrence Ferrell, who obtained his PhD in economics in 1979 from the University of Toronto and also holds an LLB London degree and LEC from the Hugh Wooding Law School, a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. He is admitted to practice law in Barbados and in Trinidad and Tobago and is also a certified mediator. He is a fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago, a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. He has published several scholarly articles in economics, written Central Bank in Trinidad and Tobago, and co-edited Caribbean Monetary Integration. His book, The Underachieving Society, Development Policy and Strategy in Trinidad and Tobago, 1959 to 2008, was published in 2012. His latest book, We Like It So, Cultural Roots of Economic Underachievement, will be published in 2016. He has served on several government-appointed committees addressing various public policy issues, including the Vision 2020 Core Group, the Task Force on the Future of BWIA, and the State Enterprise Review Committee. He is currently the sitting chairman of the Economic Development Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming, to give you the feature address, Dr. Terrence Ferrell.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and thank you very much, Professor Bissessor, for your very warm welcome. I'm always, of course, delighted to come back to the St. Augustine campus, and I must say that actually in the last 9 or 10 months that I have been on the Economic Development Advisory Board, I have probably been to this campus more often than I have been in the previous 10 years. and not just to this faculty, but also I've been to engineering. Next week I'm going to visit the COCO Research Center and so on. So I'll explain a little bit later on some of the kinds of initiatives and so on that we are about in terms of the Economic Development Advisory Board and link what I want to say this morning to that issue. So, and I also, of course, want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Martin Franklin, who is being honored here today. He has, I think, labored for many years at the coalface here in the Department of Economics, trying to improve numeracy and mathematical skills and ability to reason logically to this generation of young economists. And I salute his efforts over the years, Martin. So let me begin by making what might be two somewhat provocative observations, and those of you who know me know that I may be sometimes a little bit provocative. The first is that the perception that the UWI as a whole and the Department of Economics are not impacting the progress of our economy and society in the ways and to the extent that some would like or expect. That is a very broad brush perception, and which, like all such statements, I think is almost certainly wrong. Yet, it is an enduring perception. UWI, in the view of some, has become an undergraduate degree factory. It has lost much of its regional character, and despite individual excellent research work in some places, it is weak generally in research and innovation. In the case of the economics department, the research work there is having little or no impact on policymaking in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider region. So that's my first provocative statement. Secondly, recently I was chatting with an economist friend of mine who was actually a former permanent secretary in one of the OECS territories. And he commented that there were, in his experience in working with the government in that country, he's no longer there, was that persons without training in economics have absolutely no difficulty making pronouncements, offering policy prescriptions, and even challenging the work of trained economists, while they would never do the same with engineers, actuarial scientists, or any other discipline. And I think that part of the reason for that lies in the fact that economists, that we use everyday words like price and demand, supply, money, and so on, and that even very technical and complex concepts like GDP, which is a very technical and complex concept, have been appropriated by non-economists who really have no idea what it means, still less how it is computed and how it is to be interpreted. But part of the reason, I think, is that the profession has never determined who should and should not be labeled economist. And as a result, there are persons call themselves or are called economists who do the profession a grave disservice with their utterances in the public media and on social media. I call no names. We economists have no professional certification, but for myself, I do not personally regard someone as an economist who does not have a postgraduate degree in economics from a good university, so that they are equipped with a good grasp of economic theory, and in addition, who have 3 to 5 years of practice doing economic work, which requires that person to understand where economic data comes from, how those data are constructed, and how data should be used and not abused. Even after that, it takes years of such practice dealing with real economic problems and issues before one can be called an expert. That is a designation which, unfortunately, the media lavishes on almost anyone willing to speak on an issue. And in this country, of course, we are never short of speakers. So having got that off my chest, I would like to address some issues of economic policy which have become salient for me in respect of the set of issues that I have encountered in the recent months as chairman of the Economic Development Advisory Board. While issues of fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policy, of course, are always being discussed ad nauseum, I have been intrigued by a set of microeconomic issues relating to subsidies, the operation and regulation of certain markets, and the distribution of wealth and incomes in our society. Some of those issues are of considerable significance for government fiscal operations and for economic growth and development, but seem to be overlooked by the commentators and, I dare say, economists alike. So I would like to focus on 3 issues. 1, subsidies. 2, income and wealth inequality. And 3, the labor market and our work ethic. And I must say I'm posing questions. I am not providing answers, analysis or answers. These are issues that have come up for me which I think are live issues which require us to now focus, in my view, some attention on these issues. So let us start with the question of subsidies. It is true that many people have commented on the size and growth of transfers and subsidies in the government's budget. We can look at the gross numbers, and in fact, the gross numbers are quite startling. The trouble is that the way in which the Ministry of Finance put these numbers together does not really help us to understand what are the policies underlying the data intended to do and what those policies are in fact doing. The Ministry of Finance puts together its budget for the service of Trinidad and Tobago, in other words, the government to spend money. But the budget numbers themselves have to be recast by economists who are trying to understand the economic impact of the budget, and by statisticians to understand the impact of the budget in terms of the national income accounts. So you just simply can't take the budget numbers and talk about them. They have to be recast because the way in which the Ministry of Finance puts those numbers together is for their own purposes. And by the way, the Ministry of Finance is using a financial accounting system that is 40 years old. It is archaic. It is lumbering. It is in crisis, quite frankly. As one of the reasons why the budget division in the Ministry of Finance takes months to prepare the budget because they are using a system, a software system that is decades old. But that's not the issue that we want to deal with here this morning. So the point is you can't simply take those numbers. You've got to take those numbers and you've got to recast them for your purposes. Now, a couple of observations can be made about the data and the classification of the data on transfers and subsidies. First of all, the category current transfers and subsidies is a very mixed bag. It includes, in the estimates of expenditure, it includes transfers to the Infrastructure Development Fund, which of course is used for capital formation, and actually not necessarily in the current year. It could be capital formation in any subsequent year after that. Direct transfers to households in the form of, say, for example, pension payments, senior citizens grants, disability grants, social assistance, and so on, which would flow to consumption expenditure. There are production subsidies in there. There are consumption subsidies. There are payments to international and regional organizations such as the CDB and the Council of Legal Education and so on and so forth. So when people say the transfers and subsidies budget is too large and it should be cut, you have to understand what is inside of there, and some things that are inside of there can't be cut. Your transfers that you are paying to international organizations and so on are not things that are discretionary. They are part of your contractual agreements, international treaties, and so on. So that you really have to take the numbers apart to understand what is inside of that transfers and subsidies budget. Secondly, there is anomalous treatment of state enterprises and statutory bodies in the budget numbers. Current transfers to statutory bodies includes transfers to entities like WASA, but the regional health authorities, which are also created by statute, are classified under other transfers in the current transfers and subsidies head for the Ministry of Health. So again, you really have to get into the numbers and understand what is happening inside of those numbers in order to figure out what is in fact going on. Now, I would point out parenthetically that the continuation of government's unfunded pension system, which nobody talks about, is a major issue because public servants, there is no pension plan for public servants. So that all public service retirees are paid out of current revenues. And that has been the case since forever. And there has been talk about it, but nobody has done anything about it. Jamaica has now finally bitten the bullet on that issue and decided that there needs to be a pension plan for public servants. One of the interesting things I found out at the State Enterprise Review Committee is that you have statutory bodies which, when they are set up by statute, like for example the Agricultural Development Bank and the Chagaramas Development Authority, set up by statute, and the statute requires those entities to establish a pension plan for their employees. They don't establish any pension plan. And when those employees retire under the pension services legislation, it is the central government that has to pay the pensions of those employees. That number in the budget, if you see that number in the budget, it is a huge number. But yet, we are not dealing with this issue of our unfunded pension liabilities in the budget. A major issue that is an elephant in the room that we are not dealing with. But that's a digression, if I may say so. So let's then turn to the specific issue of the subsidy. And one of the first points I want to make here is that there are hidden subsidies, there are cross subsidies, there are tax expenditures, which we can note. Hidden subsidies occur where the private sector or individuals benefit from acquiring state-owned assets or benefits at prices which are below market, of course, but which are not explicitly intended to be subsidized. They're there if you know how to look for them, and it is really, I think, an economist who will have to identify, hold on a minute, this is a subsidy that is inside of there. Because they're hidden, because I would argue that not even the Minister of Finance knows that he's paying a subsidy. And we encountered a couple of them in the work of the State Enterprise Review Committee. For example, and this is one of the examples that we found, if state-owned lands are leased at some original lease rent, which at the time was market-based, but the lease rent fails to be adjusted over time, that lessee or tenant has the benefit of a subsidy of which the Minister of Finance may be none the wiser. And I'm saying to you that that is a real something that is happening now. There are private sector people who are tenants of certain state lands who are paying next to nothing, well below the market rates, are quite happy with those circumstances, but it is not transparent to the Ministry of Finance. Part of the reason why some of it is being paid through state enterprises. Now this example, which is real, goes to the larger question of subsidies which were established years or decades ago and which have simply remained in effect without review or reform. There are a lot of those. There are a lot of those. In fact, the current issue that we are talking about in the country, the question of the fuel subsidy was established in 1974, 40 years ago. And we've just simply kept it. It's just gone on and on until we are now confronted today with the issue that we have to deal with this problem. Until the fuel subsidy got to the point where 2 or 3 years ago, it was over $4 billion in the government's fiscal budget. So there needs to be some focus inside of government which is looking at these issues continuously. And I'm saying one of the points I want to make is that this work is work that has to be done by economists. Cross-subsidies arise where revenue from one area are used to meet expenses in another area which is loss-making. The loss-making area is therefore effectively cross-subsidized and may also be a hidden subsidy if the management of the state enterprise or statutory board does not explicitly recognize and acknowledge the subsidy. We found instances of those in our work on the State Enterprise Review Committee. Tax expenditures are deductions or exemptions which have the effect of reducing government revenue and subsidizing the beneficiaries of the deduction or exemption. The special capital allowances enjoyed by upstream companies is an example of a tax expenditure which has had a dramatic impact on government revenues, as we know, in the current year and will do so in the last fiscal year and will do so in this fiscal year as well. The importance, therefore, of identifying hidden and cross subsidies and tax expenditures is that the analysis of subsidies must be based on transparency and clarity about the beneficiaries and what the subsidy is or was intended to do. One of the interesting things about government operations is that governments do things, they institute policies, and then they forget about them. And they just simply go on and on and on until something eventually blows up. These things need to be continuously under review, and I'm saying the review has to be done by economists in the Ministry of Finance or in ministries. Now, there are a host of explicit subsidies. These include the fuel subsidy, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, other transportation subsidies, including the water taxis, the ferry, the Tobago ferry, buses. I'm going to talk a little bit about GATE. Errol Sims is here. You won't like what I have to say. Housing subsidies, utility subsidies, which is WASA and T and Tech, and there's something called the Food Price Support Program, on which I have no information, but where the budget allocation is a couple of $100 million. So I have nothing to say about the food support program because I don't know anything about it, but there's a lot of money in the budget. So on the fuel subsidy, I don't have much to say because of the excellent work done by Marissa Chester on this issue. And I want to compliment Marissa Chester for, I think she's now progressing on to the PhD for her work on the fuel subsidies. And I want to highlight it because it goes to the point of what I want to make in this address in terms of the relationship between the Department of Economics and policy making and the kinds of issues that need to be addressed by the department, hopefully in terms of its research, supporting government policy making. And Marissa's work was quite excellent and continuing quite excellent work that she's done on the fuel subsidy. Now, this year's budget has an allocation of $800 million for the fuel subsidy, which is mainly diesel, of course, because super and premium are not subsidized at current price levels. In fact, premium, which I use, is now taxed, which is nothing wrong with that, actually. I have no difficulty paying the tax and premium. In other Caribbean countries, fuel is taxed. In St. Lucia, fuel is taxed. You pay a tax when you buy fuel in places like St. Lucia, while we complain about the fact that the thing is being subsidized. Trinidad and Tobago has the lowest, one of the lowest costs for fuel in the hemisphere. Well, I think Venezuela, only Venezuela might be lower than we are. So, in my view, the subsidy, of course, should have been removed completely, and we should have formulated a regime and announced the price adjustments, a regime for the changes in the prices at the pumps going forward, because oil prices are going to go back up slowly. They will go back up, and as that happens, prices at the pump will have to go back up, but you need to work out some kind of formula for doing that and tell the population you need to expect that the price of diesel and premium and so on is going to go up in the future. So the case for the removal of the fuel subsidy, in my view, has always been compelling. Removal would change the transportation preferences of the traveling public away from single occupancy vehicles. It is astonishing. All of us would have come up here from the west or from the east in traffic, and you look into every single vehicle, and in 90% of them, there is one person in that vehicle. One person. And I go down to Chaguanas yesterday, and I'm looking at the traffic north and south on the highway coming up into Port of Spain, and I could not see a single bus. For miles, not one bus. So the removal of the fuel subsidy can have an impact on people's transportation preferences. We reduce the use of fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We will shift the fuel mix towards CNG and eliminate the smuggling of diesel to offshore fishing vessels and to other Caribbean countries, which has been one of the effects that we've had of the subsidy of diesel. In addition, it is almost certainly the case that the subsidy is regressive, benefiting upper income persons more than lower income persons. So in my view, the case for the removal of the fuel subsidy is an absolutely compelling story. From a policy perspective, one would therefore need to examine the implications of the removal of the fuel subsidy. So that, to Professor Bisesso's point, economists don't live in a bubble that is only about prices and incomes and so on and so forth. We are living in a society, and what the things that we do, the policies that we institute, do have real impacts on people's lives. And we need to understand that. The best economists are the ones who have a deep understanding of the society in which they operate, have an appreciation of the politics, not that they are politicians, right? But you have an appreciation of politicians and what issues that politicians face. That's extremely important. That's what makes a good economist. So we would expect the cost of transportation to increase and prices to rise as a result of the increased cost of commercial deliveries being passed on in the form of higher prices. This will, of course, other things being equal, lead to a reduction in people's disposable incomes of consumers, which is, of course, the wealth effect. But I want to focus on the substitution effect of higher transportation costs and how that is expected to influence the consumption of transportation and the mode of transportation. We know that public transportation is in terrible shape. And it is not clear at all to me why the PTSC does not respond to what appears to be a deficiency in the private provision of public transportation. It's not happening, but the PTSC does not respond. And very interestingly, yesterday, I was just happening to be listening to I-95.5, and I think it was Tony and Dale were interviewing some guy from the PTSC who was talking about the bus that went over the precipice in Tobago. And the gentleman from the PTSC told him that the PTSC has 27 different kinds of buses. 27 different kinds of buses. He said that every time a new administration come in, they go and they buy some different kind of bus. So you have problems for spare parts, and the cost of repair and so on is just keeps escalating. And therefore, when we see that, we have to ask the question, why does that happen? Why does that happen? It is irrational, clearly. Any economist would tell you It doesn't make sense. If you have a fleet, if you're flying aircraft or you have buses and so on, you have one or two types of vehicle because it lowers the cost of spare parts and repairs, procurement is cheaper and so on. That is a no-brainer. You don't have to be an economist to figure that out. So when you have 27 different parts, something else is happening inside of there which we need to understand and we need to interrogate. So I'm a big advocate for a massive expansion in the bus transportation. Rapid rail is not feasible from an economic point of view, but a massive increase in bus transportation. And of course, if you do that, it is likely to cost maybe more than $800 million by removing the fuel subsidy, maybe more. But I think, and I think it probably would do that. But the key differences, I think, that make the idea attractive is that the plan would be developed and implemented by a transportation authority, a regulatory body that would set the rules and regulations by which public transportation would be provided by both the state-owned providers, PTSC, Caribbean Airlines, and the Port Authority, as well as by private operators, taxis and maxi taxis and so on. We have no such regulatory authority, and Uber is coming apparently to Trinidad as well. We have no regulatory authority in this country that looks at the whole transportation system and regulates it. The transportation authority, I think, could insist on minimum levels of service to be provided by public transportation systems, and when this system is sufficiently mature and regulatory capacity is fully developed, elements of the public system may be then privatized, and the subsidy element of public transportation, which of course is always going to be present, can be even better targeted excuse me, at the lowest cost to taxpayers. So I am an advocate as well for the creation of a transportation authority which manages, monitors, and manages the subsidy that we provide through public transportation. In respect to the water taxis and the Tobago ferry, which are allocated $36 million, and the Tobago ferry $240 million in the current transfers of this year's budget. And I think that there's certainly some element of cross-subsidization that is taking place in respect to the water taxis, which is under the responsibility of NIDCO. NIDCO is a state enterprise which is doing the water taxis. You have the Port Authority, which is doing the Tobago ferry. You have the Civil Aviation Authority and Transport doing the air bridge and so on, and there is no coordinating mechanism dealing with all of these transportation services. So the analysis, I think, of the effectiveness of these subsidies and their design therefore clearly intersects several other socioeconomic issues other than providing cheap transportation. They include the environmental impact and the national goals in respect of achieving a green economy, worker productivity, which is influenced by traffic congestion and ease of movement, and preferences for modes of transportation which may be influenced by socio-cultural factors and biases. You will note then that the design of the subsidies for transportation cannot involve only economists and transportation engineers, Professor Vicesa, but must also involve environmentalists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, and psychologists. Yes, we want to get economists involved in looking at the issue of these subsidies, but if something like transportation, where culturally, middle-class people and upper-class people in Trinidad and Tobago will not get on a PTSC bus, ever, at any time. Not that there are many of them around to get on in the first place, but they will not get on them. But they are happy to go on a bus in London and in New York and in Boston. They will go on a bus anywhere. But they will not go on a bus in Trinidad. Why is that? I think it has to do with the perception of the status of riding on a bus in Trinidad. And so maybe the President of the Republic or the Prime Minister need to start taking the bus to work, and then maybe, hopefully, the rest of us will find it is not infra-dig to go on a PTSC bus. Let me just turn quickly to the GATE subsidy. The GATE report has not been published, Professor Sims, right? It's not been published, but I happen to see it. And from the viewpoint of the economist, I think that the report provides no theoretical appreciation of the subsidies for education and seem content to draw conclusions based on comparison with other countries, while faced with the lack of data, and I'm going to come back to this lack of data issue, the empirical basis for assessing regressivity, which they suggested was there, and program effectiveness seems to me to be questionable. But that goes back to the whole question of data and the lack of data that we have for policy analysis and making policy in this country. And there's a very interesting story in today's Guardian newspaper, which I don't know how many of you have seen that story. And it is that 4 officers of the Central Statistical Office have been suspended and are being referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions because of the suspicion that they may have been manipulating the data in respect of unemployment in this country. Now, let me tell you something. I have written about this issue. I have written about the CSO for many years, and finally something is being done about it, that the CSO had collapsed. And one of the things that I noted was that this unemployment rate that we have been publishing for years does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. It flies in the face of what we understand in terms of economic theory. How is it that you have an economy that is contracting and unemployment is falling? How does that happen? But there was no explanation. Nobody attempted to deal with that issue. Now we are seeing, it may be true, maybe not be true. We are, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything and so on. But here we are saying there are people who are manipulating the data inside of the CSO. Well, if I said that the CSO had collapsed, and I thought it had collapsed in terms of its processes and its systems and its capabilities, but this represents an absolute low that we can go. That if there are people inside of there who were manipulating data, that means that there is nothing that the CSO can put out, whether it is on prices, whether it is on national income, anything that we can now believe. That, if it is true, is a crisis. So, getting back to the point, I don't know that digression on data and on the GATE issue in terms of the GATE subsidy. But I think that one of the things that comes out of the GATE report is that we've designed, the subsidy for the GATE was not designed in 2005. We went from dollar for dollar and we stumbled into GATE for political reasons, but nobody looked at, we said, look, let us increase the proportion of tertiary graduates, and we put out a number there, and we went after that number, and the consequences of that has been a huge expansion in terms of the government subsidy, which apparently was $600 million, and some people say it is actually much more than that. Right? So we expanded that, but also we need to look at what the real impact of that has been in terms, not only in terms of the numbers of graduates that we've had, but on the quality of graduates that we've had as a result of that, and whether or not those graduates are having or are likely to have an impact on our economic development going forward. Housing and mortgage interest subsidies, similarly, we have major issues inside of there. The housing subsidy is so massive. Unlike the fuel subsidy, which everybody gets, housing subsidy only goes to people who are lucky enough to get allocated a house by the HDC. And if you think about it as an economist, it explains why in 2005, when the HDC was created from the former National Housing Authority, there were 22,000 people who were on the waiting list for houses in the country. Today, that number is over 160,000 people who are on the waiting list for houses in this country. It just simply makes sense. Right? It's what Uric Bob says is a very good example of Say's law at work. And then, of course, you have, in addition to that, you have the lottery element of the allocation of these houses. And people are prepared to wait for it because the subsidy on the house that you get is massive. And compounded to that, we have had very recently and it's in the public domain, so I'm not certainly not telling tales out of school, in respect of the lands, the ex-Caroni workers were supposed or have been getting residential and agricultural lots as part of the settlement for the dismantling of Caroni. And part of that process was the development of residential lots for ex-Caroni workers. And the cost of developing those lots under the EMBD increased sevenfold. Why? Because the contractors were the ones who were making all of the money. And that if, therefore, the cost of the development of a lot becomes translated into the eventual market price or the price of that lot or the house that sits eventually on that lot, that recipient would have received a subsidy from the state of the order of several hundred thousands of dollars. We need to understand what is going on in the place. We need to understand why the budget was the kind of size that it was. And of course, there are the utility subsidies, which are the WASA and TNTEC. But let me turn to the issue of income and wealth inequality. Again, we have a bit of a paradox. Because when we look at our per capita income numbers, the GDP numbers, the aggregate data of GDP, it tells a story of an economy and a society which is not doing too badly. According to the different estimates that you have, GDP per capita is about 18,000 US, 20,000 US, depending on what calculation people are using. Not too bad. We are an upper middle income country. We've been graduated by the World Bank and so on. When we look at the Human Development Index, we are classified as a high human development country with a rank of 64, number 64 in 2015. And yet, our poverty levels in the country are reportedly very high and growing, and stubbornly so. Underemployment is apparently very high. And the perennial complaint in response to budgetary measures which impact the prices of goods and services is that a lot of people will suffer and they will not be able to make ends meet. So here again, I think we have what seems to be something of an inconsistency between what the aggregate data is telling us, the average, right, and what other data are suggesting. Now, if this perception is valid, there are several possible explanations which are, of course, not mutually exclusive. First is that income and wealth inequality is worse than we think in this country. And in fact, the Economic Development Advisory Board is now starting a research project on the question of income and wealth inequality. Our concern is not simply to refresh the calculations of the Gini coefficient and so on, and distribution of income by deciles, but to inquire into questions of land ownership and land values and executive pay in this country, which we suspect will reveal a lot of information about wealth inequality as well as income inequality. The second possibility is that the informal and underground economies are larger than we think and are not, of course, captured in the official statistics. The Jamaicans understand that. In the case of Jamaica, the estimate that I have seen for the informal economy in Jamaica, which is done by the Planning Institute of Jamaica, is that 35% of the Jamaican economy is part of the informal economy. We have never bothered with it here because we have always felt that the informal economy was marginal to overall, but maybe it is not. And when you hear what some people talk, some business people talk about what is going on in the place, it may well be that this economy is larger than we think. The third possible explanation is that transfers and subsidies are important to welfare, but the delivery of those subsidies is distorted so that beneficiaries are not impacted sufficiently. The point here is that some proportion of transfers and subsidies is flowing into the wrong hands. And again, there's a very interesting story in the newspapers this week by the minister responsible for social development, because the government came in, they did a process of actually requiring everybody who was getting food cards to be re-registered and to get biometric identification to get your food card. And the number of people with food cards went down from about 45,000 to less than 30,000. Food card fraud had been massive. And of course, the government is paying for that, taxpayers are paying for that. And I think the fourth point that I want to make is that transfers and subsidies may be important, but their impact on the beneficiaries is not captured well in the surveys that we do. So therefore, we need to have some way of correlating the receipt of government transfers, and those, by the way, total about $20 billion. When you add up all of the social assistance that is done across various ministries, Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Community Development, Ministry of Sport, I'm talking about live sport, and so on, going into people's hands, you find that that number is of the order of about $20 billion, a lot of money. And it needs to be, and so how do we take that into account in terms of assessing the welfare of people? The third and last broad issue that I'd like to highlight is our poor work ethic and the functioning of the labor markets. Now, the Global Competitiveness Report, and I had some slides, but I haven't been using them, so I'll use this one. And this comes from the last Global Competitiveness Report survey. And of course, typically says, yes, Trinidad and Tobago, the business executives say Trinidad and Tobago, if you're ranking all of the bad things that we have, the most problematic factors for doing business, at the top of the list has always been poor work ethic. Now, what does that mean? Are we lazy? Is it that Trinidadians... By the way, the National Tripartite Advisory Council has on its agenda to interrogate this question of a poor work ethic and so on. So it's a serious issue. The government is taking it seriously and so on, and the private sector clearly believes that we have a poor work ethic. But is it that we are lazy people? Is it that we are unmotivated or demotivated? Is it that we are poorly supervised and managed? Is it that workers routinely turn up late and are not diligent in the performance of their tasks? What is it, this poor work ethic that we're talking about? And is it a cause of something, or is it the effect of something? Now, I have a couple of thoughts and hypotheses about this issue, which I think may be worthy of research. Strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, in thinking about this issue, I have found myself going back to Arthur Lewis. The modern or capitalist sector, if you could call it that, which is in our case is the energy sector and a few export manufacturers, produce for export and employ very few people. Wage levels in that sector, however, are not established in relation to the subsistence sector, but in relation to international wage levels. And this is where, in my view, it begins to differ from Lewis's model, because in Lewis's model, as you recall, the wage in the capitalist sector, or the modern sector, is just simply the wage in the subsistence sector plus a premium. That's what it is. But I'm saying no, the wage in the energy sector is determined completely differently, completely looked at international factors. The subsistence sector, right, is the rest of the economy. That's the rest of us, including and especially the public sector. In fact, Courtney Blackman, former governor of the Central Bank of Barbados, used to say that the public sector in our economies is the equivalent of the subsistence sector in the Lewis model, because it employs more people than it needs. And so therefore what you have is what one might call, what I call a kind of work-sharing system that we have outside of the modern or capitalist sector or energy sector in our case. The consequences of this work-sharing arrangement are reflected or manifested in the behaviors that we observe. One, because there is insufficient work to keep everyone busy, the available work is parceled out, and workers are therefore inclined to stretch out the tasks as long as possible. You have to look busy, okay? It is what somebody from the Employers Consultative Association, she talk about absenteeism, that is when the worker is away from the job, from the workplace. She talks about presenteeism. And so people are there, but they're not doing anything. Secondly, the second effect, I think, is rather more insidious. Real work does, in fact, have to get done. Crimes have to be detected and prosecuted. Judgments have to be handed down by judges and so on. So there must be people who could get these things done. But the work-sharing arrangement means that average wage levels are low, and those persons at the management and professional levels are underpaid or perceive themselves to be underpaid relative to the modern sector. They, in turn, do not manage or supervise diligently, and the whole system works slowly. That, I think, is, we should interrogate, we should investigate it, we should research it. I think that is what is our poor work ethic in this country. And it has fundamentally to do with the fact that we have an economy which does not generate sufficient demand to employ people at decent wages. And that demand has to, in my view, be external demand. So that puts me, I think, a little bit at odds with the proponents of the so-called onshore economy. And I'm not going to discuss that position now. I consider a lot of the things that I think about have been influenced by Lloyd Best, but I have never bought into the offshore dichotomy and so on. And that instead, I have always argued that the issue has been our mode of insertion into the global economy, and that we have to engage the global economy, but do so in ways that we craft ourselves and are not imposed by others. So, in conclusion, I want to come back to where I started. Professional economists need to reassert their value and their role in the national discourse on economic issues. We have ceded the field to others, and we dilute the analytical rigor of what we have to say to such an extent that we run the risk of making statements that are wishy-washy and without theoretical or empirical foundation. The media's approach to dealing with complex issues does not help, based as it seems on the notion that complex economic issues can be reduced to a screaming headline, which ends up misleading the public. Fortunately, we are no longer completely reliant on traditional media for getting our message across in ways that meets the standards of the profession without being abstract or academic. In this regard, I would like to compliment Suniti Miraj and Gregory Maguire for the Seminar for Professionals series, which they are conducting, which attempts to create a forum where issues can be properly defined, articulated, and discussed in a way that educates and informs. Turning finally to the role of the UWI and the Economics Department in influencing policy making, I would say first that to the extent that the influence is weak or lacking, it is not entirely the fault of the university or the department. Policy making based on research and professional input is lacking within government. The decline of the CSO, I think, was emblematic of that approach to policy making. But the questions which concern policymakers are not necessarily formulated in ways that are in a helpful way by academics. The interaction between academics and policymaking has to be closer and more intense for the questions and issues which trouble policymakers to be taken on board by academic research. I have tried to identify some of those questions and issues which I think might usefully be researched, and the conclusions which could directly and immediately assist in the design and implementation of better policies. And I put them up there. How should incentives and disincentives be designed so as to achieve an optimal transportation mix? If status is a barrier to the use of public transportation, what techniques from the field of behavioral economics might be used to change behaviors? Not just price, but using techniques from behavioral economics to change people's behavior that we want to change. I think that's worthy of some study. A tracer study of gate beneficiaries to determine to what extent the society has benefited from their education and training. And you need to design a methodology to be able to capture that. How can transfers and subsidies be taken into account in measuring household incomes and welfare? What explains relative wage levels between the public and private sectors? Does work sharing really occur, and does it have a depressive effect on public sector wage levels? Is the housing allocation system equitable? And if not, how should an equitable allocation system be designed? Ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to move this country forward. We need better policies, and we need better policy making, which means asking the right questions and getting the right people, that is, real professional economists, to address these questions. Working with other professionals, such as transportation engineers and planners and architects and psychologists and so on and so forth. That is what the economics department, the Economic Advisory Board is beginning to do. We would love to engage the UWI in the work that needs to be done, specifically the Department of Economics, in addressing impactful policy issues such as those that I have suggested, but also, of course, other UWI departments in the areas of science, technology, and innovation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.